Welcome, everyone. I'm Lee Merriweather, and with me is Todd Orson. Todd and I are partners at the law firm of Merriweather & Tharp, and you're listening to Merriweather & Tharp Radio on the new Talk 106.7. Here you'll learn about divorce, family law, tips on how to save your marriage if it's in the middle of a crisis, and from time to time, even tips on how to take your marriage to the next level. If you want to read more about us, you can always check us out online at AtlantaDivorceTeam.com. All right.
So did you win?
I'm not telling you.
You're not telling me, right? Something tells me if you won that most recent lottery, you wouldn't be here.
I would still be here. I love our audience.
Yeah, I would be phoning in from the south of France, I think. But no, I unfortunately didn't win the $1.6 billion lottery.
Yes.
But I'm not bringing that up for just any reason. What's the topic of our show, Lee, by the way?
Well, the topic is what does the lottery, an inheritance, a personal injury award have in common with the divorce?
Wow. Well, then I got to tell you, that's the fact that I brought that up is pretty timely.
Yeah, it is.
Wow.
That's, you would think we had put together some notes on that.
I would think that.
Well, you know, and what happened was actually all the talk about the lottery and everything it got us thinking about all the cases that we've had that were kind of started because someone suddenly had this big windfall. And what's also interesting is the National Endowment for Financial Education said that about 70% of people who win the lottery or get another big windfall, perhaps it's an inheritance or a personal injury award or something like that, they actually end up broke a few years later. And, you know, and I think that Egan goes on to say that a lot of them file for bankruptcy within 5 years. So they not only go broke, they go bankrupt. And
look, we just did a show on celebrities. I mean, we see that all the time where you hear about celebrities and or usually athletes where they may have been top of their game, but they made poor choices. They didn't get the good help that they needed, the management and financial direction from experts that they needed. And they blew millions and millions and millions of dollars, and now they don't have two nickels to rub together. Yep. And it's unfortunate. And it's, it's not that I'm just saying I feel bad for those ex-athletes. I feel bad for anyone who doesn't make the right choices because a windfall like that should make it so that you and your family never have to worry again.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, too many people make, lack of a better way of saying, just poor choices that aren't focused on saving and investing. It's more on spending and enjoying.
Right. Or it's a lot of times, interestingly enough, it's giving too.
Yeah.
And giving to the wrong groups. You know,
That's why I wouldn't give any at all. Especially not you. No.
Well, I would give some to you.
I feel so bad.
So, but I mean, you'll see people with, and we've seen it. I've seen it in the cases where somebody got a big personal injury award of $5-6 million, and next thing you know, all these friends they never knew they had were showing up to their house, and they're just handing them $50,000 here and $70,000 there, and next thing you know, the $5 million is down to $1 million in 1 year.
Can I have the address? I'm going to swing by after the show.
Well, I think the money's all gone now. That was several years ago. But we see this, and the statistics from this national endowment. I mean, they reflect that too. They reflect what we see. That statistically speaking, if you come into a big financial award, it's likely to be a curse if you do not take the time to plan things out. Really get the help around you that you need. When I say help, like financial advisors and everything, because as you said, if you deal with it the correct way, that should set your family up for life, where you may never have to, especially with $1.6 billion, you never have to work again. Even if, we know the government's going to take half, but so if you get, what would that would be, $800 million. The interest alone should cover your bills.
I don't know how I would survive, but whatever. I mean, it's, I have needs. I'm just telling you, I want at least one space shuttle, and
I don't think you can afford that. Isn't that like $1 billion at least?
well, they're not flying anymore. Maybe I can pick up a used one. I don't know.
I've seen your taste in boats. You would just go through it in boats.
All right, hold on. All right, we need to take a daydream break.
Oh, my. All right. Well, we want to talk about how we see these cases, these big windfalls of money, how they impact families, how, talk about some of the divorce situations that we have seen come out of it, and also talk about how courts deal with big one-time awards of whether it be an inheritance or a lottery winning or a personal injury case. How do courts deal with that when it comes to equitable division, an award of alimony or award of child support? And, if somebody does file for divorce around this time, what does the court do with it? There's an interesting anecdote here from a case that I read about 10, 15 years ago where a woman had won a lottery. And this may have been in California, which is a community property state, which means that everything's automatically split 50-50. Well, she didn't tell her husband about the lottery winnings.
Oops.
And the judge went and granted the divorce and split up their marital assets 50-50. And then he discovered that she had won the lottery before the divorce was granted, went back to court, and the judge was so incensed that gave
100%.
100% to the husband. So because she lied, she didn't get anything.
I got to tell you, if I were a judge, I can't say I would do anything differently.
Right.
Because, when you come, if I were a judge and you came before me and that issue was presented to me, I too would be incensed. I would be incredibly angry. I would say, you know what, why shouldn't I look at it as if you committed a fraud upon this court?
Mm-hmm.
You lied when you submitted whatever documentation saying this is what the estate looks like, these are the assets that exist.
You swore under oath to it.
And you ignored the lottery winnings.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? I'm not going to ignore it. And your husband's going to have a happy day on the way out.
Yeah.
But we see people all the time, and they're, there's so many things that we need to or should dig into, not just how to, invest and how to disclose, but there are issues also of, how to protect the assets, how to protect from one spouse just walking away with the money.
Right.
There are safeguards that you should put in place, even when things are good, dual signatures, things like that, to make, because we've seen many cases where a windfall comes in, and next thing you know, it's gone.
Yeah. So that's what we want to talk about briefly is that, we see these big windfalls trigger a divorce, and usually fairly quickly. Sometimes it triggers it because literally the parties had been wanting to get a divorce, but they could not afford to divorce because they couldn't afford two separate households, and they get the windfall, and that's actually an amicable divorce. And then I've seen cases where there was where it really was bordering on greed, where husband wins a personal injury settlement. And what happened was he was on a ladder, and that ladder collapsed, and it injured a certain part of his body. I won't say what part, but it's one that's exclusive to men.
His manhood?
His manhood, yes, injured that. And now part of the claim was loss of consortium, but he suddenly got a significant award of money. I mean, huge. And the money went in the bank account, and then the next day, the wife took it out and went and hired a lawyer. So
that is what we call in the business insult to injury.
Yes.
And
because not only she walked away with money because of his personal injury that's going to impact for him for the rest of his life. All of a sudden he finds out that the only reason she was having a happy face was because she was just waiting for this money to come in and then to divorce him. So
what'd you do?
So we filed an emergency hearing. We got an emergency hearing. Normally money is not a basis for a court to grant an emergency hearing, but because of the amount of the money and that it was cash that could quickly disappear, the court actually gave me an emergency hearing, and the court ordered that the money be put into an escrow account, an IOLTA account. We actually put it in our IOLTA account to protect it until the end of the case when we decide what to do with it. But didn't you have cases where someone comes into an award and the other side, it may look on the surface like they're being greedy, but they're actually not. So like that case I was telling you about, there was where someone they'd had a personal injury award again and gotten several $1 million because of a brain injury, and they were blowing through all the money. And the problem was there's a mom over here who has a child and she needs support. And so she was wanting some of that money up front because she knew he was going to go through it all and he couldn't work ever again. So there'd be no way for her to get any support from him. So, we're going to talk about next. We're going to talk about that scenario, what the court will do with that one-time settlement of millions of dollars in a personal injury suit, how the court will actually award child support based on that. So when we come next, we're going to get into that. Welcome, everyone. I'm Lee Merriweather, and with me is Todd Orston. Todd and I are partners at the law firm of Merriweather and Tharp, and you're listening to Merriweather and Tharp Radio on the new Talk 106.7. If you want to read more about us, you can always check us out online at AtlantaDivorceTeam.com. Well, today we're talking about the lottery that I didn't win.
I'm not bitter.
He told me those were the winning numbers.
You know what? The person I bought from told me also. And I think we have a lawsuit on our hands.
Oh, maybe. Yeah. No, so we're talking about how lotto winnings, personal injury settlements, inheritances, how they impact, or what do they have in common with divorces? How do courts deal with them when they happen? And we were talking about how a lot of times we see when one party gets a big windfall, that a divorce is not very far behind, sometimes literally the next day, unfortunately. But what do the courts do when we encounter this? Because there's three elements that it comes into. One is equitable division, or in Georgia, it's equitable division. I should say asset division. If I'm talking about nationally, all the courts divide up the assets that are accumulated during the course of a marriage. Now, some of it, like California, it's a community property state where everything's 50-50. Georgia and Florida is an equitable division state. So that, every state's a little bit different. And so if you're getting ready to go through a divorce, you definitely want to talk to, if you're not here in Georgia or Florida, you need to talk to your local lawyer about how they handle it. But here in Georgia, it's equitable division. That's how they divide everything up. And the courts treat the different inheritance differently than a lottery, differently than a personal injury settlement or a workers' comp settlement. So we're going to get into all those things. So, all right, where do we start?
I have no idea. I was enthralled listening to you. No, let's talk about the fun one first. Let's talk about lottery.
Okay.
And so a lottery win, 100% is marital property. Mm-hmm. Okay, and maybe what we should do right now, just very quickly do a recap on some of the, at least for Georgia, some of the definitions. Okay, when you're dividing assets, you're going to divide between marital, or not divide, but you're going to identify as assets being either marital or separate in nature.
Right.
Okay, so marital or non-marital, separate property. Marital is anything that you obtain during the marriage except through gift or inheritance.
Mm-hmm.
Separate property is anything you had prior to the marriage and anything, that you get through gift or inheritance during the marriage. And there's a lot of nuances.
And there's some other nuances. Yeah. We'll get into a few of those nuances.
Exactly. So when you're talking about equitable division is, the way I define it, what is fair and reasonable under the certain circumstances or specific circumstances of your particular case.
Right. Which doesn't mean necessarily 50-50.
That's right. It absolutely does not mean that. It could mean, and often does mean, 50-50. Oftentimes, or a lot of times, it also means 60-40 or 55-45.
Right.
Whatever. It's whatever's fair and reasonable. So when you're looking at it now through that lens, a lottery win is 100% marital because
there's nothing separate about it. It is marital. It was purchased during the course of a marriage, the lotto tickets, and there's nothing to make it separate.
That's right. And I got to tell you, so many people will come, they'll talk to us, and they'll be like, well, I worked and I earned, and it's my money, my money,
Right.
my money.
I set aside all that money in the 401k came from my salary. Well, it was a result of marital efforts. I mean, efforts, you could say, well, it's my individual. Well, the courts, when you're married, they look at you and your spouse is one unit, not you individually.
That's right.
Title doesn't matter in most states, especially here in Georgia, that whoever's name is on the car or the house or the 401k statement doesn't matter. The question is, was it accumulated during the course of the marriage? And there's a sub to that, like, was it a result of marital efforts?
And so lottery, again, falls squarely into the marital column, if you will, because it is something that was done during the marriage, arguably, and you won it.
I just realized, I wonder what would happen if somebody got an inheritance and took some of that inheritance to buy a lottery.
I know. I was thinking the exact same thing. I didn't want to go there because I think we need a show just based on that. But yeah, or separate property. I wasn't even thinking about. I was thinking of it in terms of they have some kind of a separate asset.
Yeah.
Go and they buy a lottery ticket.
Would that make it separate
Would the
property?
winning constitute a separate asset because it was a transfer of one separate asset to create another
one.
asset?
Yeah.
And so anyway, to our audience, I'm sorry, and we'll get back to you with answers on that.
But it is an interesting question.
It is an interesting point because
But we've never had it happen before.
since you bring that up, let's at least explain that. If you have, let's say, a separate asset, if you have an account, and in that account is $10, and you had that account before you got married, and then you get married, and let's say fast forward 5 years, 10 years, you still have that account, and that same exact $10 is sitting in that
has
account.
$10.50.
Yeah, right, exactly. or in 3 or 5 cents, whatever. But now you've got that same exact $10. You haven't put money in. You haven't taken money out.
You haven't changed the name on the account.
That's right. Everything is the same. Then you can say that's my separate property. Now, if you have that $10 in that account, you get married, and from that point forward, you deposit your income, and you take money out and pay bills, and you put money in from your work, and take money out and put money in, so on and so forth. And 10 years goes by, and then you have $10. Let's say it just so happens you have $10 in that account. And you say, well, that's my $10. It's my premarital account. That's my $10. No, you cannot say it's the exact same $10 that you had back then that you have now.
And the court's going to pretty much say you commingled the funds.
That's right.
So you lost your separate property claim.
Right. So here with lottery, you have to understand it is 100% a marital asset. You bought the ticket. That nuance that we were talking about, like I said, that would be a deeper analysis. But assuming you didn't use separate property to buy the ticket, you buy the ticket, you win the lottery. It is now a marital asset. It is subject to division.
And I will say this. So the courts, let's say that hypothetical, the court said, well, fine, I'll find that your lotto winnings are your separate property because you purchased with a separate account. Proving that, I think, would be very difficult because you can only buy lotto tickets in cash. But let's assume that the court did that. The court has the ability to award lump sum alimony. So let's say you got an award of $1 million, or the person did, and they were claiming it was their separate property. The court could actually say, but I'm going to award this other spouse $500,000 in lump sum alimony. And they don't have to say where it comes from. That is not a division of the assets. It is simply an award of lump sum alimony, and that's what it's called.
Yeah, and you see that more often, more definitely because I've never dealt with a situation where a lottery winning amount was deemed to be separate property, unless it was won before the marriage. But you deal with that where somebody comes into a big inheritance,
Right.
and they stop working because they don't need to work anymore, and the other party is like, well, hold on one second, I need help. I need financial help. Can I get some of the inheritance? And the answer is
No, because it's separate property.
that's right. So then, therefore, what can I do? I need help.
Right.
Okay, that's fine. We can't get you any of that inheritance, but what we can do is go after alimony.
Right.
We can establish for the court you have a financial need. You are dependent on your spouse for your support and maintenance. And when they say, well, but hold on one second, I'm not working. I don't have any income with which to pay support, then the court can say what?
They can look at your inheritance and say, actually, you do have the ability to pay some support and award it based on your overall financial situation, regardless of the equitable division, because the analysis from the support standpoint is different than the analysis from the equitable division standpoint. So that's what people need to understand. Like, the courts may not be able to divide up a separate property inheritance, but the court can take that into consideration, even in equitable division. Now, a lot of times they don't, and I think it depends on the amount of money, frankly, because it's equitable, the court's looking at things. But like, you've got I'll give two ranges. So you've got a situation where someone inherited $100,000. Well, I've seen where the courts go, that's her mama's money, and we're not going to take that. That's not fair. She keeps that 100, and we split everything else 50-50. But then I've seen the other ranges where someone inherited $3-4 million, and the court said, well, you've got your $3-4 million. I'm going to give her 95% of the marital estate. I'm giving you your car or whatever. But I mean, the court can, because they say, well, that's fair because you're walking away with $3 million.
Yeah, the estate could be worth $100,000, let's
right.
say, and by the time you sell assets and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And the court says, hold on one second. You have $4 million in the bank that I can't touch, meaning the court can't
right.
award her any portion of that, and therefore I'm going to give her $90,000,
mm-hmm.
and you get your $4 million and $10,000. I think that's a pretty fair split. Again, equitable doesn't need to be equal. It's
right.
what the court feels is fair.
So the court's given a lot of discretion on how to handle these big one-time awards. So if you think that you're going to be able to walk into court and just, have your cake and eat it too, maybe not. Up next, we're going to talk more about how the courts handle these big one-time awards of cash. Welcome, everyone. I'm Lee Merriweather, and with me is Todd Orson. Todd and I are partners at the law firm of Merriweather and Tharp, and you're listening to Merriweather and Tharp Radio on the new Talk 106.7. If you want to read more about us, you can always check us out online at AtlantaDivorceTeam.com. Well, today we've been talking about the fact that Todd and I didn't win the lottery. Neither of us did. And how Todd would abandon our audience had he won it, and I wouldn't have. No, just kidding.
I just would have phoned in from someplace warm and tropical.
No, but in all seriousness, we're talking about we've seen situations where someone gets a big financial windfall, that they didn't necessarily earn. I think that's the key thing, because we've seen situations with perhaps someone sells a business. Well, they worked all those years, so that wasn't necessarily a big windfall. Yeah, they just got a lot of cash, but there was a lot of work involved to build up that business to get that money. These are ones where you just suddenly money comes in, and there wasn't a lot of physical effort to obtain it, and people can tend to look at it differently. It can trigger divorces, and then we're talking about how do the courts deal with it from the standpoint of how do they divide up these different kinds of big awards, and how do they deal with it for support? Because the court has to address that in every case. Well, we left off talking about equitable division.
Right, equitable division, and mostly as it relates to like a lottery win, okay,
right.
which 100% we have defined as a marital asset. Doesn't matter whose account it goes into, doesn't matter who bought the ticket, paid for the ticket, anything.
Yeah.
All right. It is absolutely 100% a marital asset subject to division. How the court's going to divide it, equitably speaking, it might be 50-50, 45-55, something, more or less than that.
It all depends on the circumstances
right.
and facts of the case.
Now, I will tell you, typically, and it's not that we have a lot of experience dealing with ginormous lottery winnings like this, okay? But a court's not going to feel that one party earned it more than the other.
Right.
So you might want to go into that kind of a situation expecting a 50-50 split.
Right.
Because the court's going to be like, it's a windfall, should be a windfall for both of you.
Exactly.
So now let's turn our attention to inheritance. Mm-hmm. Inheritance is much different. Let's say you are very, very lucky and have some very affluent relatives, and it's that same $1.6 billion. God, that's anyway.
That's a big number.
Yeah, it's a big number. But no, let's just say it's a big. I can't even think when I start thinking about those numbers. So it's a big inheritance. Okay. Is the other party, the other spouse, going to be able to get their hands on some portion of the inheritance in terms of equitable division?
It depends. Was that inheritance converted to marital property? And so in Georgia, at least, the courts can look at what did you do with that money. So let's say, for instance, you have $100,000. You inherited $200,000. You owed $200,000 on your mortgage that was in the house is in the name of both you and your spouse, and you take that $200,000, pay off the house. The court can say you converted that to marital property, and the court can then divide it equitably. Now, the courts can also say, from an equitable standpoint, I don't think it's fair that the other spouse gets this windfall because, of
an altruistic, or maybe not purely altruistic, but a decision made by the other spouse to, rather than put that money into a separate protected account to pay off the mortgage to benefit you guys.
Yeah.
So, there is definitely an equitable argument.
And I think it also depends on the totality of the circumstances, meaning, like, were they married just a few years and this happened? Not really fair to suddenly have that be a windfall for the other party. But if they were married for 30 years, well, I mean, that's a long time to be together, and the court may just split that 50-50. So again, the circumstances can change the answer to that question, and the court has a lot of discretion as far as what it can do.
Yeah, I mean, the takeaway, or a takeaway there, should be, if you are going to be coming into possession of a big asset like that through inheritance, the bottom line is there are things you can do to protect it, and there are things you could do that can destroy or damage the separate nature of the asset. All right? There are commingling issues that we see all the time. Commingling is to define commingling is basically you are taking, let's use that example I used, the $10.
Right.
And remember when I said you bring that $10 account into the marriage, but during the marriage you take some of the money you earned from your work, put it into the account, but then you pay some bills out of the account, and then you put some more money you earned into the account. You've now mingled, you've now mixed the marital money that you're earning during the marriage with the separate property money that was already in the account. And money doesn't have a unique identity.
Right. It doesn't.
Right? So, it does, but nobody looks at the serial numbers on a dollar. So, so if you have a dollar in the, sometimes the example I use is we'll have a big bowl of candy, and it's all the same candy, let's say. And I'll take one piece of candy out, and I'll say, this is your piece of candy. You just inherited this. And then I'll take it and I'll throw it into that bowl. I'll mix it up and I'll say, go get that piece of candy. And they'll say, I can't. I don't know which one is which. Exactly. So now you've mixed them together, and you therefore very potentially, if not probably, destroy the separate nature of the money that was in there.
Right. So, all right. Now, let's talk about personal injury awards, or like a workers' compensation awards. Now, this is an interesting animal because there are portions of this that are considered separate, and there's portions of it that may not be considered separate. So let's say you get a personal injury award. We can talk about the different types of awards, but we'll just stick with a personal injury award for now because that's the one we see most commonly. And usually a personal injury award is made up of pain and suffering, lost wages, potential loss in earning income, maybe some disability, reimbursement for healthcare expenses.
Or like the example that you talked about, the loss of consortium.
Yes, and so sometimes it includes that, which is belongs to the other party. And so what'll happen is the courts a long time ago there was a case that came out decades ago that said that one spouse should not benefit from the pain and suffering of the other spouse. And with that case, the Georgia Supreme Court said basically a personal injury settlement, the pain and suffering portion of the personal injury settlement is separate property. Now, but if you had lost wages because you were unemployed for several months, that is a marital asset, because if you hadn't been in the accident, you would have earned that money that would have gone to pay some bills. And so that is considered marital. If you were reimbursed for medical bills, so let's say you had a high deductible and you paid $5,000 out of pocket for 3 years, and then you got $15,000 part of that personal injury settlement, it can be argued that's marital because marital funds went to pay for the hospital bills or whatever the medical bills were. So those are all taken into consideration by the courts. Now, the big challenge is when things are settled, it's usually just a lump sum settlement for the award. So let's say it says, well, here's $500,000 for your injury. But it doesn't say this, it doesn't designate what's for pain and suffering. It doesn't designate what's for future medical bills. It doesn't designate what's for loss of consortium, which, if you don't know what that means, so if you have a husband and wife and the husband gets injured and can't do engage in sexual relations or even take care of things around the house, and the wife loses the, what do you want to say?
That partnership.
The partnership,
that,
yeah.
Emotional, whatever. We are struggling here.
Yeah.
If there ain't no plan going on, then
there's a loss of consortium
There's
claim.
a loss of consortium, and that spouse can get some compensation for that, because basically it's you injured not only him, but you injured our relationship.
Right.
And so, yeah. But I think the example you used earlier with the ladder was one of those where there was not a clear delineation. There was not a clear establishing of that amount, what portion was pain and suffering, what portion was lost wages, what portion was
so what we wound up doing in that case was going to the original demand letter that the personal injury lawyer had written. And
so you looked outside the proverbial box there.
Right, and found that in it laid out, well, this portion of it was for loss of consortium. And so we, this is years ago, and I want to say that's what we wound up settling on, whatever they had proffered to the insurance company, even though the check they wrote didn't delineate it. What they were arguing, we said, well, that should hold true. And so if you argued to this insurance company that your loss of consortium claim was only $50,000, you can't come to court now claiming it's $250,000. So, and that wound up aiding and settling the case. All right. Well, up next, we're going to get into how the courts, we're going to focus just on support. So if someone suddenly gets an award of, say, $5 million, should child support be based on that $5 million award if they only got it one time? And we're going to break down how the courts deal with it and how we've handled it in various cases. Welcome, everyone. I'm Lee Merriweather, and with me is Todd Orston. Todd and I are partners at the law firm of Merriweather and Tharp, and you're listening to Merriweather and Tharp Radio on the new Talk 106.7. If you want to read more about us, you can always check us out online at AtlantaDivorceTeam.com. Well, today we're talking about the lottery and inheritances and personal injury settlements, those big-time awards of money where people just get really excited and suddenly get a divorce.
It happens,
yeah.
And we've seen it, and we've seen people make poor decisions, and the money disappears, or they end up agreeing to things they shouldn't agree to because they didn't get help from an attorney, and money goes quickly, more quickly than it should. So people who should have, basically been protected and taken care of financially speaking for a long time suddenly find themselves in financial dire straits.
Right.
So in any event, we're trying to focus this show on these types of things because while not many people win big lotteries, there are more people that, percentage-wise, that may be involved in a lawsuit that results in, some kind of a windfall, some settlement or a verdict where it's a big payoff. Or inheritance. Obviously, there are a lot of people who inherit from a spouse, from a grandparent, from whatever. So these issues, while it may, we started the show with $1.6 billion lottery. Granted, one person that I don't like in South Carolina who won it all. Okay, I'm only kidding. I wish you well. That doesn't happen very often, but the other examples we're talking about do.
Yeah, the inheritances, the awards, the settlements of personal injury cases, workers' comp cases, we hear about those much more frequently. All right, well, let's talk about how the courts handle this from a support standpoint. And we'll start off with the situation. There was a gentleman, he was working, he was in school, and he gets in a bad car wreck, not his fault, but it causes dramatic brain injury. He, as a result of the accident, wins a $5 million award. Unfortunately, that traumatic brain injury has literally changed his personality. He is giving away money like it was water, and he's rapidly going through the $5 million. Well, he had also had a legitimation case going on at the same time where he was trying to legitimize his relationship with his son, and the mom wasn't objecting to that at all. Of course, there was issues about custody because of the way he was processing things, but we're not getting into that. We're talking about the money situation because he suddenly, during the course of the case, she was, of course, asking for child support, had an award of $5 million, but he didn't have any income. He couldn't work. He was never, unless something happens and his brain dramatically heals, he'll never be able to work again.
But he had $5 million sitting in a bank.
Well, yeah, for a few days. It was $3 million. But so she was asking for a large lump sum award, and on the surface that might look greedy. Well, she's trying to benefit from his injury. No, that's not what it was. It was there was part of it that was maybe a bit excessive, but the request itself was not unreasonable, asking for money, because the court under the Georgia child support guidelines can look at one-time winnings like lotteries, but the court does not have to say, well, you want $1 million, or wherever it came from. You want $1 million this year. So they don't put $1 million in your income column. What they may do is break it up over a reasonable period of time. So maybe it's 20 years, or maybe it's something like that. So what a court can do is say, well, what would $1 million be paid out over the course of 10, 15 years? Maybe whatever, the life of the child, or I should say the childhood life of the child till the child turns 18. What would that award look like? And then they can put that monthly figure into the child support worksheets, and it'll spit out a number. And so in this situation, though, the mother was concerned that the injured father, that he wasn't going to be able to pay in 2 years because he would have gone through all his money, and was requesting a lump sum award of child support, arguing, look, in 1 year he's gone through $2 million, and we can't account for the other $1 million. So he's only has $2 of the $5 million left, and some of that, $1 million, was supposed to be for future surgeries because he was so injured. So she was asking, I don't remember what the number was, but there was a lump sum request, which the court can actually grant.
Yeah, and it is incredibly rare. This kind of a situation, obviously, it's for this man, unfortunately, it's a horrible situation, right? But the when determining the reasonableness of what she is asking for, you have to look behind just I want money. Give me money.
Mm-hmm.
This is somebody who is responsible primarily, if not solely, for the upkeep, care, maintenance of a child.
Mm-hmm.
And the other spouse has no ability to earn, and therefore financially, not just financially, but probably also on the parenting side, she's on her own.
Yeah.
And so it's very rare, but the court does have the ability to basically, whether it's impute income or whatever methodology is used by the court, come up with a number and say, you know what, you need to participate in the raising of your child or children, and this is how we're going to do it. And thank goodness you have a $5 million amount, but you're blowing through it like nobody's business. So this is how we're going to handle this, and this is going to make sure that you've participated in the payment of these expenses.
Right. And so now it was interesting because, in cases where, like even the personal injury award, let's say for the $5 million, let's say that was counted as pain and suffering. All right. Well, the court, and even that situation, could say, well, if it was a divorce situation, the court could say, well, that's your separate property. I can't divide it up equitably. But your soon-to-be ex-spouse needs some extra support for the care for this child because you're not going to be able to. Mm-hmm. And she may not be able to go to a full-time job at first. So the court can say, all right, you're going to have to pay her $1 million in lump sum alimony, and there's nothing you can do about it. I mean, you could appeal it, but odds of you winning aren't that good in that situation. So the court, again, as we've been stressing, has a lot of discretion in this area. While there are certain laws in place governing these, how the court can address it from an equitable division standpoint, the court does have flexibility when it comes to support awards. Not to say the courts will do that, and I'm not even sure I have ever seen a court award. There was an inheritance. I don't think I've even seen a court take the inheritance into consideration for the purposes of awarding child support.
I haven't either, but that's also because in most of those situations, it was an able-bodied
both parties were working,
right, that had the ability to pay support regardless of what assets they received through inheritance.
Right.
So it, like I said, it's very rare, but there is the possibility, and so we've had other parties. Usually we can communicate with our clients who are in a similar situation. They come into a large amount of money, and we can explain to them the realities and what a court can and might do to keep them reasonable.
Right.
But we've seen people come in and they were working, they were earning, they come into a large inheritance, and next thing you know, they're unemployed, and they're trying to play that game of, oh, I don't have any income.
Right.
I can't support, I can't this, I can't that. And at that point, what the court is going to do is impute income. Imputation of income means basically it's a fiction. It's the court basically saying you have the ability to go out and earn X amount of dollars per month. You are voluntarily choosing not to, so I'm going to pretend like that's your income.
Right.
And we're going to use that income level to set child support and basically determine what your obligation should be. So, the court can impute income, and we've had, many cases where the other party takes that position, I can't earn, and the court says, well, yeah, you can. Yeah. You're choosing not to, but get out your checkbook because, you need to.
You've got money in the bank. I see it.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't hide that from me. But, the other thing is that we didn't touch on, but we probably should just mention, is that let's say you've already gotten a divorce and you suddenly come into a lottery when you've won the lottery and you were receiving alimony. That can absolutely be a basis, or even a huge inheritance or a personal injury settlement. Any of those situations where there's a large influx of cash can be a basis to come back to court to modify your support obligation or what you're receiving. So if you suddenly if you were receiving alimony and suddenly got a big financial windfall, the opposing party or your ex-spouse can come in and ask for the amount that they're paying you to be reduced or eliminated.
Well, because it's based on need. And so if you went to court and got alimony in the first place because you didn't have the ability to financially take care of yourself, then it's because of need. You suddenly come into $5 million, that need is no longer there. It's the same reason why when you get remarried, that acts as a trigger to very potentially and likely terminate the alimony obligation, because now there's an assumption that the new spouse is going to step in and provide that level of care that the alimony was supposed to take care of.
Well, that about wraps up this show. I really enjoyed talking about lottos that I didn't win, but but it is really an interesting subject on how the courts deal with it. If you want to learn more about us, you can always check us out online at AtlantaDivorceTeam.com.
This audio program does not establish an attorney-client relationship with Meriwether and Tharp.